Welcome to That Annuity Show, the podcast that will make you an expert in explaining annuities to your clients. Give us 30 minutes each week and we'll shave hours from your client presentations. Now, here's your host, Paul Tyler.
Hi, this is Paul Tyler, and welcome to another episode of That Annuity Show. And with me are our full complement of co-hosts. Mark Fitzgerald, how are you?
I'm doing great, Paul. Good morning.
Hey, Will Moorcroft, we've been spending a lot of time together.
Yeah, it's all good. It's good to be here as well.
It is indeed. We're I'm learning something new every day. And Ramsey, good to see you.
Always great to be here.
Yeah, and with us today, we've got a very special guest, Mr. Matt Carey, who is a RIA, actually, you've worked on Wall Street. You're a teacher of finance at Iona, and you are director of the Center for Financial Market Studies at the La Penta School of Business, and your company is Blue Spark. So, Matt, you've got a very interesting and impressive background. Tell us a little bit about who you are, your company, and what you're doing at Iona.
Sure. Thanks for having me, guys. I appreciate it. Blue Spark was founded in 2012 by Maura Griffin, and Maura and I have been working together since that time. And we're a small registered investment advisory, and we had a mission at the start to focus on, particularly on women and women who are coming off maybe a divorce or are widows and have certain needs, and it kind of been, maybe not the breadwinner in the family, and all of a sudden found themselves with the need to manage their own finances and maybe a little bit of money. So part of that mission is really education, and I think it kind of dovetails nicely with what I've been also doing since 2011, which is, I've almost been 10 years here at the La Penta School at Iona College, teaching college kids about finance and markets, and trying to get them prepared to go out in the world and understand things like annuities and how you can compound for the future and make sure in this age where very few people will receive any kind of defined benefit, how they're going to manage to live out the rest of their life and not be dependent on others for what they need.
Matt, when you started teaching, was there any kind of surprises that you came across in terms of their baseline level of education coming in around finance?
Actually, I was more surprised at my own baseline level, honestly. It's hard. I found myself in my first class that I ever taught, which was MBA level investments, going back to, interestingly enough, they used the same textbook that they used when I was at Kellogg back in the 1990s at Northwestern, the Bodie, Kane, and Marcus investments text. It's just now like into the 13th or 14th edition. But I had to teach myself, reteach, and go back to all the things that I probably brain dumped back in the 1990s to get a real academic grounding in that, to be able to explain it to others. And I think, a lot of students, what you don't realize is that when you're teaching, particularly an introductory finance class, that you have students that may not be focused on going into finance, and it's just kind of a roadblock for them, or that's the way they view it, as a roadblock to, okay, I got to get this requirement out of the way. So there's a real varying level of, I would say, motivation and a knowledge, of course, and most people don't know enough, or they confuse it with accounting. And I can remember my professor at Kellogg in my intro finance class saying, accountants have all sorts of games in which we have no interest, and in finance we care about cash flow. So I try to come at it and build from that perspective and make sure that it's always forward looking. But it's a big disparity in terms of what students know and what they actually want to get out of a certain class.
I'm curious, how different is it to explain these concepts to students versus clients who obviously have more life experience but may not actually have taken the course?
Well, it's a good point. In a lot of ways, it's the same, because you really have to get it into a level where people find it understandable and digestible. Okay, so when you're trying to speak to a client and talk to them about here's what you need to do and here's how compounding is on your side. I think Einstein called compounding the eighth wonder of the world or something like that. You try and preach that to them in the fact that you can't disturb the compounding, and then you have to go forward to even have a chance to get to the goals that you need to get to, which requires discipline. And with students, you're trying to, essentially do the same thing. I mean, once you've reached them on that, I think it opens a lot of doors. So there's a big similarity there, and when you talk to somebody who's been out in the world 20 years and has started a 401k and has started saving for things, a lot of times they're more simpatico. They understand the things that you understand a little bit better. Whereas a student, you're coming in raw with a chance to kind of shape them and shape their outlook on how this goes. And they may know nothing. I mean, they may have no idea. I know when I graduated from my undergrad, I had taken a total of one accounting class for non-business students in my 4 years at Georgetown. And I got out, I knew nothing until I went to business school and started to learn everything that I didn't have any idea that I was getting into. And when I got out in the world, I was in the Army. I was an Army officer, and there was a company called USPA that would hunt down junior officers and try and put you into all sorts of investments. And you're in kind of a vulnerable position because at that point, you're starting a career and you should be saving, but you really have no idea how to go about it. So that shaped it shapes today a lot of how I approach things with people and what they need to know when they get out of school and start speaking to professionals who, in many cases, may not have their best interests at heart, which is where we come at it from Blue Spark as a fiduciary. We have to do everything in your best interest to make sure that you're taken care of, as opposed to, say, a broker who might operate under a suitability standard and not really, you don't understand that. You don't, as a client, maybe, that you don't understand where their recommendations are coming from. But I try and impress on people the difference between the two as well.
Hey, Matt, can you talk a little bit about that? You made the jump from like the broker-dealer world and to the RIA world, and when you did that, and what was the catalyst for you or your firm to make that move?
Sure. Well, for me, it was really a big break career-wise. I had been in on the institutional side and in debt origination, working on a trading desk for 15 years, and I had a 7 and a 63 and a 24. And I wasn't really dealing with individuals. I was dealing with sophisticated institutions, so I didn't run into a lot of that, even though that's what the tests are geared for. But the banks, they like to have everybody licensed on that level. So I did understand, some of the basics of that, but it wasn't pertinent to my day-to-day. And when I finally got out and I had a transition period and I decided, when Maura came to me and explained this concept of an RIA, I had no idea at first what she was talking about. And then digging into it and actually studying for the 65 and getting to really understand, okay, I'm getting into a world that's very different. And it's one there that I have to put myself in the client's shoes and understand that, or there can be consequences to that if I'm not careful and I don't do that. So it was a big break, and a move in a different direction that took me there, completely different from where I had been.
So, Matt, I had a quick question. You talked about young Army officers being approached by advisors, and it sounds like there are a lot of you coach a lot more people than may necessarily end up inside being Blue Spark customers. So you're giving general advice. What are some of the questions that these folks should ask? So they're approached by somebody who's got more information than they do.
Sure.
And what are the gating questions that you recommend that they ask to try to figure out is this person somebody I should be working with?
Sure. I think I have a son who's now a junior Army officer, so it's kind of like deja vu in trying to teach him about things. And he calls me and he said, I got a call from this guy. What do I do? And I say, tell him your father's your financial advisor and you're taken care of. Thanks. But I think part of it is, when you step back, and the thing that got me personally, and I didn't understand it until a friend of mine laughed at me when I was being sold as a junior Army officer mutual funds in an IRA setting that had a pretty heavy load up front. And of course, I didn't know the difference. I wasn't very well versed in that. So now when I speak to people, for instance, I said, make sure when you're being sold something that you understand what the fees are, because again, that's money that's coming out of your pocket and going into somebody else's, and it's not going to be part of that compounding as you go forward. So you've got to understand the classes of shares at a minimum and what the load might be on that, because that's just money that's not going to be part of that, and you have better options than that. So what I try to tell people is to understand, essentially, the fee structures of what a person's coming at you. The question to ask them, are you a fiduciary or are you a broker? What's the standard you're being held to? And just so that they understand, fiduciary means they're supposed to have my back. If somebody's talking to me about a suitability standard, then, it's really about what they think they can do with my money and not necessarily what's best for me.
So one of the thing that you had mentioned in the introduction is that you work a lot with female clients. You work a lot with divorcees and widows. Tell me about what those conversations look like. How are those conversations different than with other client base? What are the concerns that are usually front of mind for those, for those personas, if you will? Sure.
Well, there's not, for me, at least in my experience, there's not really a typical one. That people are all over the map, and in a lot of ways, it's not that much different in many cases from speaking to a student who has no idea, because you may find a woman that was home taking care of the kids and may not have worked in a long time, and the husband's income took care of everything, and maybe didn't even pay the bills or do anything, and all of a sudden here she is at age 45 or 50 years old, never having had to do that, and you're having to sort of start back to square one. And it reminds me a lot, actually, of what you do with students, except that they haven't had any other experiences, so it might be completely foreign to them, whereas somebody who's 40 looking for help or 50 looking for help may have a general idea but be overwhelmed by the process and have a lot of anxiety about it. So the key is to sort of step back and talk to them on a level that's not condescending and say, listen, this is more common than you think, and we need to work on a strategy so you can trust me to try and help you to navigate your way through that and find the best solution for you. But there's a lot of emotion and anxiety that are wrapped up in that.
And having that specialty in terms of helping people navigate through that, does that influence your planning practice at all with young individuals coming in terms of how you go through the process of setting them up?
Yeah, in some ways it does, in terms of, part of it is being tuned into sort of the relationship that they have and being not necessarily an amateur psychologist, but having to be kind of tuned into body language and other things and see how the couple, as you start out going forward, when you're with a young couple, what's their interaction like, and who's doing what and who's informed of what, and trying to keep them informed. One of the things, I'm a CDFA, Certified Divorce Financial Analyst, so I can't, if I have a couple that decides to split, I can't advise them on the divorce because they're my client together. So I have to refer them to somebody else that would be able to take that so that I don't have a conflict of interest there. But if somebody comes to me before they're a client and says, I'd like divorce advisory, then it's a different story. And it's, if a woman comes to me or if a man comes to me and says, I need to, be advised on this and can you help me through the process, then that's a new engagement. But I don't, when I'm starting out with there are things that enter my mind, like, okay, should this be a joint account, or are people trying to, if somebody's got accounts all over the place and you're sort of spinning through your head saying, okay, well, what's the purpose of this? Why are we getting a little bit complicated here? Is there something going on? In which case, you got to be careful about where you push into, but just sort of keeping one eye on that, that scenario and being ready in case something happens.
Hey, Matt, just a quick time to move to another subject. How are you marketing these days? How are you growing your practice? What does that typically look like for you?
We get a lot of referrals. We had some pretty solid growth in the early years, I think from 2012 to 2015, 16, and got to a point where I have to be careful because I have both of these things going on, and in order to do justice to both sides, it's something that I got to manage pretty carefully in terms of how much I take on and what I'm able to do. And I'm finding out, there's only so many hours a day, even when you're not commuting and doing other things. And there are a lot of, at various times there's a lot of pull. So we've been getting, we get referrals. Maura, my partner, maybe takes 2 new clients a year, or it's, people in and out, but she's pretty much at capacity. I have more capacity, I would say. I try and keep it to the point where I really look at the engagement that's being proposed and whether or not it makes sense and I can do it. So we do turn away business. But it's, in this day of COVID, I guess really we've relied on referrals that are coming in or things that come in through the company site, and then make a decision on whether or not to, we're interested in taking on the engagement.
Are you still working out of your office, and having people come in and visit with you there face to face, or did you go fully remote?
No, we've stopped face to face visits, and we've really relied on Zoom. And you know what? Frankly, my client base skews toward people that are pretty tech savvy. I do have some older folks that it's harder, and you're still talking about phones and things. But for most of the young folks, it's just another Zoom call, and it's pretty easy, and they're used to it. We were worried about that, I'm sure, as everybody was in the beginning. But I spend a lot of time on Zoom. I teach on Zoom. I actually teach in the classroom as well. So we're teaching kind of what's called a mixed mode, where I'm being filmed and the students have the option to be in class or in Zoom. And, in many days it's me and a couple others in a classroom, and most of the people are dialing in. And, we'll see where that goes with education. It's kind of an interesting time to contemplate what that looks like on the other end. But I think in the professional side and in the investment advisory, we kind of made that leap to Zoom pretty easily. And it's been okay. It's been, there are times when you wish you could go out and, have a coffee with somebody or sit down. And I will say I have done that a couple of times on certain occasions with people that are sort of in the local area, appropriate social distancing and all, or even a porch meeting with a client where I've got a young couple with a young child and they have a patio, and we've done some of that in the warmer weather. So you just got to be creative.
So real curious, given your focus on divorce and I'm just wondering how the pandemic has influenced, issues that have come up or the rapidity. It feels like, either this pandemic brought you closer together or, man, whatever was fracture you had in relationships, they came to the surface. I mean, how would you describe the mood?
Yeah, in a lot of the groups that I've been a part of and anecdotally hearing about that there's supposed to be a big uptick in divorce, in particular gray divorce, and I have not, I've seen a little bit in the practice where we've had more. We probably increased. I don't know what the percentage is, but it's a fairly meaningful increase in inquiries where somebody says, you get a something through the website or a phone call or something that says, I've had this issue and I want to be advised on how to proceed forward with the divorce. And a lot of times, frankly, you get people that first they need a lawyer before, or at least the way they propose it. But what you would like to do is actually get people early in the process to review with them and say, well, here's, if you take that step, this is what the potential might look like. And we've gotten a few. I'm not quite certain if it's more. I'm not watching the data and I'm not cutting it, so I'm not certain if it's meaningfully more than in a normal time period. But anecdotally, from the groups that I'm a part of, there's an expectation that when this sort of moves on, and we start to open up again, that there might be people that take the step that maybe wouldn't have, and they're just at the point where they realized or did a lot of soul searching or just couldn't take it any longer and decided to make that move.
Yeah, as you've sort of, it sounds like you've transitioned your practice over time towards more female-oriented clientele. Have you had to change how you approach discussions, presentations, material, or is it, same Matt, just different clients?
Yeah, I think it's the same me. I mean, I grew up in a big family. I was one of 7 kids. I had 3 on each side, 3 brothers and 3 sisters. So, I've always been able to speak to women, and never really had much of a problem with that, although my wife might disagree with you on that. But I think part of it is, you got to be able to tune into people when there's a need. And sometimes in this practice, when you're juggling all these balls, and I'm sure you guys go through the same thing, where it's like people say, well, how do you have this many clients and how do you cover that many clients? Well, not everybody, like being in a big family, not everybody needs all the attention at once. So you have to turn your focus to where the attention is needed, and where, and anybody who's had children understands this, that sometimes you can't be equal to everybody at all times, that you've got to focus where it's most critical. So I think in terms of seeking out a client that has a real need and really is calling out for help, you got to respond to that and really sort of train your guns on that and be able to help them walk through it and help them. And the money thing we understand is creates such anxiety for people. And I've been there myself. I understand it. I've been on the earth 55 years, so I've gone through my fair share of getting knocked down and having to get up. So I get it, and I understand people who have no idea how they're going to pay for what looks like an astronomical price tag for college, and they're really kind of beset by that. And you have to sit them down and say, listen, there's lots of solutions to that problem. You don't have to do what you think, or maybe what you think the path is going to be for you. There's a bunch of different options, and we can take a look at that. Or people that have, you have a mortgage that in the pandemic you got pushed back or knocked back, and maybe your hours were cut back or you were furloughed, and you're saying, how am I going to be able to do this? Because all people have had to do is say, I'm just putting money away and I'm moving forward. And now you got a whole new source of anxiety, and how are you going to get through the, what we don't know when this is going to end. If you take yourself back to last June, it was pretty dire, and there were people saying, how much longer can I take this? And then things started to sort of, at least around here in New York, it was that way, where you had, people who lived in New York City were full of all sorts of anxiety that they hadn't had ever before, and really, you just try and say, here's the strategies. We don't know, but here's the strategies that we think you need to start considering and we need to be ready for.
So you said something very interesting. So you've got a practice that's grown, and you get a lot of inquiry, and you think very carefully about who you add into the mix. And so I guess I've got 2 questions. The first one is, how do you decide, what's the right client to bring on board? And then the second question, which I'll repeat after you answer the first one, but I'll give you a heads up here, is where do you send them? So the people that come in and they're not necessarily a fit, where are you sending them? Are you referring to other shops that you think are trustworthy? How are you handling that? So first question is, how do you decide who you bring into the fold?
Sure. Well, over the years, we've actually had to get to a point. I mean, obviously, let me step back and say we like to be a holistic planner and advisor. So a lot of the things we did early on in terms of taking like one-off financial planning engagements or one-off college planning engagements, we just can't do anymore. So we have $1 million minimum in terms of AUM. And we like to, that's the first cut, is if somebody meets that hurdle, then you sort of go a little bit further with them. There are some people that are kind of on the cusp that we might say, well, this is an interesting plan. And particularly some of the young couples that come in and you look at the future and say, okay, this is somebody we can grow with, and that there's a lot of potential here over the long term. But it's really hard. And you look at when you first start to build your business, and you're kind of taking anything, you got friends and family, anything to get going. and you've got some, maybe you got one retirement IRA or rollover, and that's providing you that. And we just, you can't do that anymore. And now we're looking at, okay, so if I get a client that has X number of assets and they want me to help them in all sorts of facets in planning, in retirement planning, in tax planning, all sorts of things, that's a much more interesting and efficient engagement for me and for Maura than it is, to try and just pull in whatever we can at any time. So when we do have somebody that comes in and it's not a fit, there's also a fit. I mean, for instance, yesterday I was on a couple of calls and you talk to somebody and you go through them with their engagement and their needs and other things, and maybe they say, well, it's not going to work for me, or you say, I don't know that there's a fit here if it's going to work. And it's a nice position to be in, to be able to say that. But I think we've kind of gotten there over time where we've realized that those are the best kind of relationships that we want to build, where it's more of a relational business rather than transactional. And in terms of when something doesn't work, if we have a client that just isn't going to work, yeah, there are places we can refer them to, and it just depends on what it is they're actually looking for in terms of total. And we're members of a bunch of different groups and meet people all the time, and I wouldn't say that there's a process for saying, okay, sorry, we can't work with you, but here's somebody that you can work with. We might sit down with them and make a couple of suggestions of people to call that are in a different phase or looking to build that would be a good fit with that person.
Yeah, and I'm curious now, Matt. You obviously work with younger individuals. When do, especially with portfolios as large as you're working with, where do annuities fit in terms of when you'd be talking to them, and when would you think they might be a good fit and they're not?
I think that as they get closer to retirement, and actually there's a very interesting engagement that I have right now with a young couple who've made a lot of money and want to have a career change. So essentially, you're talking about somebody that's retiring from their current position at age 40, and you're looking at it and going, okay, they want me to model out how to live. They'll probably do something different, but nowhere near as lucrative as what they had before. And you have to model out, how's this going to look over not your normal retirement horizon, but if you're 40, I'm running projections out to age 100. And that's a long time. And so in terms of bucketing the money and looking at it, annuities might fit for that. If you want to say, here's your 5-year cash that you're going to need, and we want to make absolutely certain that you have predictable cash flows over that 5-year period, and then we'll take a little bit more risk from 5 to 10, and maybe a little bit more risk from 10 to 15, and then anything that's in a tax deferred vehicle, we'll just say we're gonna expose ourselves to as much equity risk as we can and try and harvest that. So anything, a lot of times I try and look at things in that bucket way and say, for anybody, if you've got needs in the next 5 years, if you have needs where you're going to need to supplement your cash because your kid's going to school, or if you've got a house purchase that you want to make and you want to keep something stable, then that's where we would begin a discussion of maybe annuities would fit for them. And some of the older folks, obviously that's the traditional way of going about it. You get to somebody who's drawing down and you want a portion of that into something with predictable cash flows like an annuity or building a bond ladder at that point as well.
Matt, I guess kind of, navigating through the pandemic here, have you seen a big shift in clients' risk profile, like what they're willing to accept as risk?
The funny thing about this market shock in the pandemic is how quickly it came back, and people weren't as exposed to the pain that they were in the markets from 2007, we'll say, until 2011 or 12 or beyond. Things came back, ripping back so quickly. I don't know that people sort of, it was like waking up from a dream, and their money was coming back, so that when you got to that sort of that unnatural point of a year where we review portfolios and they go, oh, wow, I didn't realize I'd done so well. I thought the market was really bad. And so I don't know if people are really changing. I think there's a notion now, and I don't know that it's healthy. And I think the Fed came in with a lot of assistance, and you've now got a giant second or third stimulus package that's out there, that people sort of feel that there's this safety net that's going to be there. And, it leads to that buy the dip mentality and other things, and people aren't getting burned in a sustained way. Whereas after 2007 and 2008, I think you had people that were afraid to get back in and stayed on the sidelines, and you don't see that as much anymore. And it's either because maybe people have been conditioned to buy the dip, or that things snapped back relatively quickly, so the pain wasn't there in the way that it's been in the past. And I think you see that where, what are we talking about now? Just a year later, we're talking about bubbles and froth and people buying these digital assets that nobody really knows what the intrinsic value is, if there's any at all. And it just seems to be that there's a lot of money that's come roaring back pretty quickly. I mean, the way this thing came back, I don't know that people changed. And a lot of the young people, were kind of oblivious to it, because they're just working along, and now they're on Robinhood and they're trying to trade and do other things, and haven't really suffered the kind of damage that we remember from 2000 and 2008 that takes years to recover from, and causes you to sit on the sidelines for a long time.
Yeah. Hey, well, listen, we're close to the top. Matt, this has been great. Mark, Will, Ramsey, any final questions or thoughts here?
Any, with regard to your students, any of them want to follow in your footsteps, or any interest from them to jump on board and do what you do?
Yeah, you do. You always get a few kids. And the funny thing is that I think with students, they just don't understand necessarily all the different facets of finance that are out there. So they might only think in terms of, there's a stock market. No, there's lots of careers in the bond market. There's careers in wealth management. There's careers in insurance. There's all sorts of angles to this, and you got to try and educate them, not just to follow this narrow path, but to try and figure out where they might fit in. We're actually talking about launching a certificate in financial planning, and then getting involved with the CFP Institute to be able to offer that as a certificate, which would be the step towards getting them into becoming CFPs and advisors. And they have to obviously get the career experience to get the designation, but it's a first step, and it helps them to understand what the world looks like and which way you're going. So there's a lot of things, and we have to be, you got to be flexible as an institution, because there aren't always the same kind of jobs. And we have people on our alumni advisory boards that come in and talk about, I was an equity trader on the New York Stock Exchange. I couldn't tell anybody how you go about getting that job today. It used to be a path. You were a runner, and then you worked your way up, and eventually you put on the jacket and you went out on the floor. And there's not really that pipeline anymore. It's very different, and you have to get there a different way these days. So a part of our job is to keep our eyes on that, and to talk to people in the community and find ways to get these kids placed into positions where they can grow. But it's
great.
Certainly a challenge.
Thanks very much.
Sure.
So I'll just say, look, there's a few things that we talked about before the show and during the interview. Just you're doing really important work helping people understand a couple of the really basic building blocks of finance. So one is the power of compounded interest, which is something that remarkably needs to be taught every day to a lot of people, even though it's not a new concept. And then the other one is the annuity with a small a, the one you would see if you went into Webster's dictionary, right? The very
right.
Simple building block of finance, that Lego piece. You said you gave a test on it just this morning, so keep up the good work. Thank you for that. You're doing important stuff.
Sure. No, it's I think it is, and that's half the battle when you help people understand that, and you understand that if I can leave these kids with any impression, it's that you can't wait. You got to start when you're 21. If that's putting away $500 or $1,000 a year, that's what you got to do. But you got to take advantage of the tax deferral, and you got to get it rolling right away, because it's very easy to wait, and it's very easy to just sit there and go and wake up one day with a spouse and kids and go, geez, I guess I should start saving for retirement. And I always use the example with them. I had a grandfather who worked for Union Carbide in the first half of the 20th century, and he worked there. That was the only place he ever worked till he was 60 or 65, retired, and they took care of him the rest of his life, and my grandmother. And you're not getting that. Maybe if you're a policeman or a firefighter, you got maybe a non-zero probability you might get it at this age, but most of us aren't. And you're on your own, and your company's going to help you a little bit, and then they're going to say, okay, you go figure it out. So it's
and all those plans, all those public plans are underfunded, for that matter.
Right.
So
right, and it's it's either going to be more taxes for everybody, or it's going to be, we're going to start to draw that down. This is the thing I understand from my son, who's in the junior military officer. When I was in, that was it. It was an all or nothing. You stayed 20 years, or maybe if you got an early out, you got your pension, but there was no other plan. There was no defined contribution plan that you could take with you when you left. And now he's got that. He's got the TSP, and there's if he stays long enough, there would be a defined benefit. But that's good, because I left the military after 4 years, and I didn't have any plan to take with me, and I had a little bit in an IRA, but certainly if I had to transport myself back, and this reflects in the advice that I give him, I would have done things a lot differently.
Excellent. Hey, well, listen, Matt, thanks so much for joining us. If people want to, find you, learn more about your firm, where's the best place to go?
Sure. We're bluesparkfinancial.com, and we've got a full website with all sorts of good material on there. And I think I'm on Twitter as @bluesparkmatt, and they can find me there. And or if they want to check me out at Iona College, they can go to ionacollege.edu and check out the school there as well.
Excellent. All right. Well, listen, Mark, Will, Ramsey, thanks.
Pleasure.
And,
Thanks, Matt.
hey, thanks. And
Thank
join
you,
us again next week for another episode of That Annuity Show.
Thanks for listening. If you've enjoyed the show, please rate and recommend us on iTunes, Stitcher, Overcast, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also get more information at thatannuityshow.com.